Well, good morning again. So, for the past 2 months, we've been preaching through the book of 1 Peter and really looking at what it means to be resident aliens. So, I want to read through our key verse for this sermon series, which is 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. And I think it is a good reminder to keep reading this. It should be up on the screen as well. It says, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles," I'd rather the phrasing resident aliens, "to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that He visits." So for last week and this week, we're focusing on suffering. And so I think it's important to read this key verse in light of that, in the context of suffering. That even through suffering, we are called to live a life of good deeds. So that though they may accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God. Right? That's the key to that. So last week I talked about how to survive suffering, right? How do we come out of suffering? How do we come out on the other side having faith? And if you remember, I talked about being rooted, that we need to be rooted in Scripture, in prayer, in fellowship. We need the support of other Christians to lift us up, to be our editors, so to speak. That we need endurance, but not endurance that comes from our own, but the endurance that comes from knowing Jesus. And then hope and joy. That's hope and joy that is focused on the future, not on the present. Not what may be going on now, but the future of the new heavens and new earth. This week, I'm going to focus on persecution. That is the type of suffering that I'm really going to talk about. And you might ask the question, why focus on persecution when we live in a religious, tolerant environment? Well, throughout the world, Christians are suffering. That's true. There is many Christians that die daily for their faith in Asia, in the Middle East. But also, there may come a day when we don't experience the religious freedom that we have today. Right? That America could change. I'm not saying it will change, but there may be a day where religion is seen as hate speech or whatever it may be, and we might be headed there, and there are signs that we are headed there. But I will say, don't make assumptions, but we need to be prepared if it does. But even in the world that we live in now, if we speak the gospel correctly, we will probably face persecution. And when I say speak the gospel correctly, I mean speaking truth in love. Speaking truth in love. So, I'll give you for instance of what is not truth in love. If you come to somebody who is engaged in a same-sex relationship, telling that person that they are going to hell is wrong. Right? And I want to explain why. Because that's not love. And it's not your place to make. Now, do we believe as Bible-believing Christians that it is wrong? Absolutely. And calling that a sin is not wrong and is loving, right? And I've talked about this many times. When I discipline my kids, if I'm doing it correctly, I am doing it out of love. If I'm angry at them because they just did something that I don't like and I'm punishing them out of frustration, I'm not doing it out of love. So there is a difference here. And I think this is central to our topic of persecution. We may be speaking truth in love. I will always remind us to do that, to be loving in our speech. But there may come times where we speak truth in love and face persecution. 1 Peter chapter 4, flipping to chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, says this: Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourself also with the same attitude, because whomever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. I think it's extremely encouraging that we have a pioneer, right? That Jesus is the pioneer of our faith. Not only did he go ahead and not be sinful, but he also went ahead and suffered first. One of the most intimidating things you can do is be a pioneer. So when I was a kid, my mom used to read to me all the time. And one book series that she read to me was Little House on the Prairie. And I loved this book series. I was fascinated with this book series. I never got into the TV show, but I really, really loved the book series. And that's because it was about people living on a prairie and living the pioneer life. And this is a scary thing for people because they will face challenges that no one else has. And this is intimidating because it becomes difficult to know what to do, right? Nobody's gone before us, nobody has experienced this, so it becomes scary. We live in a day now where it's a Google age, so I know as a parent, we were able to Google everything, right? Oh man, the baby's doing this. Let's just Google it and see what is going on with the baby. There are people who have done this beforehand. And in our suffering, in our persecution, Jesus goes first. Our God, Jesus, suffers in front of us, ahead of us, which is helpful. So, reflecting on Jesus' death on the cross, it was not something that was just like, hey, this is some not very painful thing. The word excruciating, which I'm sure we've all used before when we stubbed our toe or cut our finger or whatever it may be, oh man, this is excruciating. But excruciating literally means from the cross. From the cross. It was an extremely painful thing. And he was persecuted. Not only this, but he dealt with complete separation from God. If you remember reading the account of Jesus on a cross, he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He says this because in that moment, the Father looked away from the Son and experienced complete separation from God. And if we end up in heaven, we will never know what that feels like. We will never know how painful that is. We will never know the complete separation from God that Jesus went through. But suffering has a goal. Suffering has a goal. And that goal is reconciliation. If your goal is reconciliation, that becomes the focus, not the suffering. So Jesus dying on the cross, his focus was not his suffering, but was reconciliation of mankind. And we get to inherit that ministry. We become ministers of reconciliation. So Peter is pointing us towards focusing on eternal things, not on temporary things. But it's always important to remember that we have a God who empathizes with us, not sympathizes. He doesn't look at us with pity and say, oh, woe is us. He feels the pain with us. I think that is pretty incredible. Going on, 1 Peter 4, 3-5 says, for you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. They are surprised that you do not join them. I think it's interesting that there is this thing that is very effective in our culture, and it's peer pressure. Peer pressure is done so much because it's effective. It works. I have seen it many times in my life. Before I came to Jesus, I was the biggest peer pressure that ever existed. If you talk to my brother, he will complain how much I have peer pressured him. To this day, I still struggle with it. Whether it's sports or games, I peer pressure people into doing these things. And when I was in my wild living, I would try to convince people to do what I was doing. Drunkenness, whatever it may be, I was trying to convince them because I wanted them to experience the fun that I was having. Well, when I became a Christian, I was not a Christian for the first 3.5 years of my high school career, and then I became a Christian. And all my friends were shocked. They were like, what has happened to this guy? And so I went from being the persecutor, the pressurer, the saying, heaping abuse on people for not doing the fun, wild things that I was doing, to now being the one persecuted. I would carry my Bible around everywhere. My friends would make fun of me. I specifically remember multiple times people making fun of me for carrying a Bible around. I mean, I carried it to every single class. It always was with me. I would bring it to lunch, and my friends, who were just really confused on what had just transpired in my life, would pour water on my Bible. They would push my Bible on the ground because they could see something had changed in me. They could see something shocking had happened in me. And to be honest, I wasn't even sure what had happened to me, and I was having difficulty reciting what had happened. But why do people persecute? Well, it's difficult sometimes to comprehend the changes in people's lives. Persecution comes out of a lack of understanding. If you study history, you'll always notice that when persecution comes, it comes out of a lack of understanding. And Peter's audience was experiencing this, but on a larger scale, right? On a bigger scale. That these people were actually losing out on jobs, that were being disassociated with in public, that were being associated with inside of families, kicked out of families. You're no longer allowed to come to family things because you are a Christian. And so we get to 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 16, and we read this last week, and it is important for us to read again. It says, "Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insomuch as you participate in the suffering of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or a thief, or any other kind of criminal, or even a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name." This, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal. For Peter's audience, they were probably very aware that this meant something different to them. Because the emperor at the time was Emperor Nero. And I have talked about Nero before. But what Nero would do is he would take Christians, he would dip them in wax, and he would light them on fire. Not only would he do that, but he would throw parties in his gardens, and the lights to this party would be burning Christians. So when Peter says, "Do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal," it brought up something very specific. There were probably people in the audience that were hearing this that had family members or friends that were burned alive by Nero. And Peter says, "Do not be surprised." This is a really hard pill for us to swallow, right? Because For us in America, comfort is the most important thing. We will do anything to be comfortable. That is essential to us. We want to be comfortable. And I don't necessarily think that it's a bad thing to want to be comfortable, except when it comes to your faith. When it comes to our faith, we must be ready to face persecution, to face challenges. It's important for us to be prepared. That we need to really think about the fact that, hey, we're going to be heaped abuse on us. We're going to be attacked for our faith. And that we need to stand tall in it. Taking a stand even when it hurts. I keep coming back to this, but if our view is that the best thing that we can do in life is see somebody else come to Jesus, if that's the best thing, if we believe that, and I truly do believe that the best thing that could happen in my life is that somebody else comes to Jesus because of my faith, through my witness, whatever it may be, then everything else doesn't matter. That is our focus. Whether somebody heaps abuse on us for not doing things the way that they perceive it should be done. The Old Testament has a lot of good stories about people facing persecution because of their faith. Daniel in the lion's den is one that I think about. But in Daniel, there is a group of 3 that experience persecution that I think it's really important. This is in chapter 3. There's these 3 guys. Their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And hey, if you haven't heard this story, my recommendation is go on Amazon. You look up VeggieTales, the bunny story. It is fantastic. I actually don't know what it's called, but what is it, Zach?
No, she knows.
I don't remember.
No,
Rack, Shack, and Benny.
what is it?
Rack, Shack, and Benny.
Rack, Shack, and Benny.
Googling it.
Right? I always get this song, The Bunny, stuck in my head. Every time Easter comes around, I sing about a chocolate bunny. Right? I love it. Watch that. That's your homework for this week. Anyway, so Shadrach and Benny, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they are living in a time where there is a king Nebuchadnezzar over the land of Babylon. He is the king. And he builds this giant golden statue. And every time music plays, everybody in the country has to worship this statue. And this went directly against the Jews who were in exile at the time in Babylon. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refuse to do that. And some men go and they tell on these 3 guys to King Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar says, hey, listen, if you are not going to bow down and worship this statue of me, you're going to be thrown into the furnace. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response in Daniel chapter 3, verses 16 through 18, is really important. So they replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So they are thrown into the furnace, and King Nebuchadnezzar makes it 7 times hotter than it usually is, and they're thrown in there, and the men that throw them in there are burnt up, and what happens is they survive, and it turns out that there is a 4th person with them, and it said it's one like the son of the gods. And so they come out, and it's a happy ending. Everybody worships God. King Nebuchadnezzar commands everybody to worship God. But this story teaches us a lot about persecution. It helps us frame persecution for us. I think it is one of the most important stories in the Old Testament about persecution. So I think that there are 4 things that it teaches us. The first thing is that persecution is about worship. The main reason for persecution is because of your worship. Christians worship differently than everybody else. We worship something different. I would say that everybody worships something. If you talk to anybody, they may say, no, I don't worship anything. I'm an agnostic. I don't worship anything. But they do. Everybody worships something. Whether it's they're Disney fans and they worship true love. You just have to have true love. Go out there and find your Prince Charming or your princess and have true love. Or happiness. I just want to be happy. Whatever that is. Or comfort. Or I will tell you one that is very popular in America since the 60s, sex. We worship something. There are idols all over the place. In fact, I would categorize almost everything and everyone to 2 things. They're either an idol or an icon. An idol points towards itself. An icon points towards something else. An idol points towards itself. It wants the worship. An icon points towards something else. As Christians, we are called to be icons. That we don't point towards ourselves, we point towards the God of the universe. As Christians, we are called to be icons. But there are all these things that either want worship or are pointing towards, whether it's sex or consumerism. You just need that brand new TV. Wealth, comfort, political ideologies. They become idols. Now, I'm not saying that all these things are necessarily bad. In their appropriate context, many of them are good. But we have so many idols that are worshipped. And if you don't worship them, you are going to experience persecution. Because people are confused. They're wondering why you don't act the way that they do. For many of us, we will be asked to do things that as Christians we just can't do. Whether it's go to strip clubs, sex before marriage. These things are put on pedestals in our society. To get drunk, what does it matter to get drunk? The Bible speaks directly against getting drunk. Doing drugs, spending all your time on self-improvement, self-help books, self-development. Spend all your money on the next fancy thing. You can't tithe because you gotta get the next fancy thing. You gotta get a nice house, whatever it may be. All of these things are products of worshiping the wrong thing. And if you don't do that, if you don't conform to society, you will probably face persecution or questions like, why? Why do that? And I'm not saying all these things are bad, but we must clearly show as Christians what we worship. Always be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have. Always be ready. We must show and point towards what we worship at all times. People need to know what you are an icon for. You're an icon for the God of the universe. The second one is we trust in God, not our interpretation about God. My favorite part of this story is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response. Our God is going to save us. He is powerful enough to save us. But even if he doesn't, what Tim Keller commentates on this, and he says, their answer is that their confidence was actually in God, not in their limited understanding of what they thought he would do. They had inner assurance that God would rescue them. However, they were not so arrogant as to be sure they were reading God right. This is important, that I think there are so many times that we think that God is going to act in a particular way, and then he doesn't. And we say, why, God? We question God. We say, oh man, maybe he's not so powerful. When I shared a lot of my suffering last week. When I went through that suffering, I directly questioned God. And I just asked so many times, why? But I found that what I was doing was limiting God. I began to limit what God could do. And that is a problem. God is God, and I am not. We need to trust God in what he is doing, even if we don't understand it. And actually, persecution and suffering allows us. It allows us to trust God more. That if we believe that through everything, no matter what happens, that God is bringing about restoration. God is bringing about restoration. We all have limited views on God. None of us know God completely because he's unknowable. In fact, I wouldn't want to worship a God that I could perfectly explain because that would mean that he is limited. I think too many times we put God in a box, right? We try to be able to explain everything about him. Is there truths about God? Yeah, the Bible points towards a lot of them, and we can depend on those truths about God. But it doesn't mean that we understand how he's going to act in every single context. Having a trusted view of God creates a posture that avoids two mistakes. God must heal/save, or God can't heal/save. And what I mean by that is, in any particular context, if we believe that God has to do this or else he's not God, we have a limited view on God. And if we believe in any circumstance that God can't heal or save, we have a limited view on God. We need to avoid these two mistakes, these two extremes. The third point is that Jesus and God is in it with us, shares in it with us. I've heard many people say, hey, where is Jesus in the Old Testament? Well, I'm going to tip my hand a little bit and actually say that I think that fourth person in the fire was Jesus. Right? And there's a couple other places where I think that I see Jesus clearly. But notice that they're thrown into the furnace, and Jesus is with them in the furnace. That is a good analogy for any suffering we might face or any persecution we might face. I will be honest that persecution and suffering bonds people. One reason why I believe that I have grown a really strong relationship with my wife is because for the past 7 years we have experienced a lot, but we have done it together. It has bonded us. I'm going to show my nerdiness a little bit, but my favorite TV show, my wife tells me that I should be embarrassed by this, I shouldn't tell it, but my favorite TV show is the TV show Survivor. If you like the TV show Survivor, please see me secretively afterwards because I just need other fans to like that show. But
There's nobody.
yeah, but and I have pictures. Zach, see me after service. So, but these people face hardship together. You will notice that after every single season, these people have strong bonds of friendship because they are going through hardship. They are starving and suffering together. As we face hardship, we bond to the people around us. That's why it's important to be in church, right? You bond to the people who are around you. You grow closer when you face hardships together. But if we let Jesus into our mess, we bond to him. If we let God and Jesus into our mess, into the fiery ordeal or the furnace, and we allow them into our suffering and our persecution, we will get really, really close to Jesus and God, the triune God. It's important. There were these people in early Christianity called the Desert mother and fathers. And so what these people did was, when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, they said, this faith is too easy, right? It's way too easy to be a Christian. Let's leave the comfort of the Roman Empire and go out to the desert. And I can tell you that they weren't going out there for the desert. They were going out there for the God of the desert. They were going to find God in the desert. Why? Because you get very, very intimate with God when you experience trials and suffering and difficulties. You have an opportunity to grow really close to God in hardships. Because Jesus is with us. I ended last service with this quote. I'm not ending this time, but a faith that has been trusted, or a faith that has been tested is one that can be trusted. A faith that has been tested is one that can be trusted. Because as you are being tested, you are holding on to God. My fourth point is that going through suffering brings glory to God. It's interesting that God achieves the end of suffering through suffering. He ends suffering. He brings about the new heavens and new earth. And this happens. The new age starts through death on a cross. That is how it all ends. That is how suffering ends, is by the God suffering, by Jesus suffering. So God brings about the end of suffering through suffering. And I think it's important. Our suffering has a purpose. It has the purpose of reconciling others. Nothing strengthens a faith more than seeing a fellow Christian suffer. Nothing. Because if you see them stand firm through everything, through the persecution, through the suffering, your faith grows. One of the biggest ways that the early church grew was by the martyr of Stephen. There is a saying that the blood of martyrs is the seeds of the church. That the church spreads when it's persecuted. I don't know why that happens. I don't understand the logic, but it happens. But also, nothing sparks a faith more than seeing somebody suffer for the faith. Nothing makes people ask questions. People get pointed towards Jesus when they see somebody else suffer. I don't understand the logic to it, but it happens that there is purpose through painful adversity. For the first 4 years of my college life, I went to a secular liberal arts college. So I became a Christian at age 18, my senior year, and then I went to college, and instead of going to a Christian university, I was like, yeah, I would like to go to a secular university. And liberal arts schools are havens for anti-God thoughts. And so I decided to minor in philosophy. So I went in and I took all these philosophy classes, and maybe you've seen the movie God's Not Dead, and you think, oh, hey, like that is so fake. That's not real. That never happens. God's Not Dead, the first movie, more homework to watch that movie. That was what my college experience was in philosophy. I went to class every single day, hearing that God wasn't real, Christian faith was wrong, whatever that may be. And somehow I found myself arguing these points in front of 100 people, maybe 20 people, every single day. I just argued from my limited knowledge of what I thought to be true. And there were many times it felt like it was 1 versus 99, right? And it was so overwhelming. But then, towards the end of class, I started to see more Christians speak up and give their view. They were scared at first, but then encouraged to share their faith because they saw somebody else standing for their faith. They saw somebody else doing it. And honestly, some of the most powerful conversations I had in college were people coming to me afterwards and just asking questions, wondering why I had a faith that I had, why I was arguing these certain points. And it was because I stood through persecution, through maybe heaps of abuse or thought of to be having hate speech, that many people came to a deeper faith, had a spark, had a nudge, that God was nudging them. So if we could take some of the big takeaways out of persecution, it is stand firm. Because this brings opportunity for growth. It brings growth in your faith. One of the best ways to grow your faith is to stand firm through hardships. It grows others' faith. And it brings others a spark. It can bring a spark. So if you guys would stand with me as Stephanie comes back up. This end song, I'm super excited for this end song because it's called Another in the Fire. So I came up here and I said, oh, hey, Steph, I was gonna ask you to play a song this week, but I decided not to. And it's Another in the Fire. And she's like, oh, you should have told me. And then she looked at me with much doubt in her voice and she said, do you want me to play it? And I said, yeah. And then that's how we got here. But I think it's important because it illuminates Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This song is about their experience. And I would encourage you to focus on the words and ponder on the words. But I said this last week, and I will say it again, that God uses broken things. It's amazing that our God uses broken things to heal things. That He uses persecution, He uses suffering to make us whole. What kind of God does that? That is what baffles me most about God and His goodness. He is so good that He uses broken things to make things whole. So I encourage you to embrace this song and embrace this theme.
I'm going to repeat what Shane said. The song has lots of words to it, and if you don't know it, it may be hard to follow. So I would encourage you, if you don't know it, instead of trying to keep up, which can be distracting sometimes, just let the Lord wash over your heart through these words. Take time to listen. Take time to just be with God, because He is in this place, and this song is about Him. So if you would like to sing along, the words are up. But if not, let Jesus speak.
There's a grace when the heart is under fire. Another way when the walls are closing in.
So, no matter what you may be going through, I'm going to read the passage I read last week as a benediction. But, hey, God's here. He's working. He's here for you. Whatever you are going through, He wants to be in it. And the God of all grace, who called you to His eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will Himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. To Him be the power forever and ever. Amen. Go in peace and love to serve the Lord.